Let's talk about the protests against Israel and the return of self-described white nationalist Nick Fuentes to Twitter. First off, I generally support the sentiment underlying the protests against Israel. Under Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition government, Israel is acting like a terrorist regime. Whether or not they are technically committing genocide is up for debate, but they are absolutely engaging in ethnic cleansing, and they are party to the disgusting abuses committed by the religious fundamentalist Israeli settlers. The fact that United States senators will support Israel to the point of threatening the International Criminal Court for wanting to issue arrest warrants for Netanyahu is evidence to the degree to which Israel holds sway over U.S. foreign policy.
The International Criminal Court in The Hague is contemplating issuing arrest warrants against senior Israeli government and military officials as war criminals.
So when I hear demands from students like this, I tend to sympathize.
So crucially, our first demand is full disclosure of financial investments.
Crucially about Israel, right?
Well, we want to know where all of the money is going. We think that that's key for students to know where their money is going, whether it's about Israel or not. But then with this knowledge, we would like to pursue full divestment from two things. First, from all arms manufacturing companies. Whether it's the current genocide in Gaza or other armed conflict around the world, our university should not be investing in that. This is a situation where we should be learning and contributing to education in a safe community, not to international conflict.
As far as the protests themselves go, the fact that there are Jewish students who are part of these protests is evidence that they are not fundamentally anti-Semitic. I don't care if it's a minority of Jews who support the protest, because after years of watching black people get told they shouldn't be listened to because they don't have the opinions that most black people do, I don't buy the argument that because it's a minority of one group of people who support something, that means it's not a serious position. The problem is, because these are left-wing protests largely, they are very susceptible to being hijacked by the far left, which is a categorically different thing than the left in general. The far left are the pro-Hamas, postmodern zealots, and moral relativists who celebrate October 7th as an act of revolutionary resistance against the settler colonial state, rather than condemning October 7th for engaging in the abhorrent practice of indiscriminately killing civilians, which the Israeli Defense Force is doing on a scale 10 times larger than that of what Hamas did on October 7th. You are in no position to condemn the Netanyahu government as a US-funded terror regime if you are not willing to say that Hamas is also a terrorist regime engaged in the indiscriminate killing of civilians. Anyone who cannot see this is ideologically possessed beyond reason. As usual, the greatest threat to the interests of the left comes from its own freaks on the fringes. The goal of protest should be to peacefully draw attention to the plight of the dispossessed and encourage specific policy changes like divesting in companies and organizations that are complicit in Israel's abhorrent behavior. When you do things like block roads, all you do is piss off the people who would otherwise support your cause. The average person in the United States doesn't support Israel because they think they're a fellow colonial state oppressing brown people. They support Israel because sane people in the center have not done a good enough job explaining how the insane religious fundamentalists in Israel are as bad as any member of Hamas, and how no moral person should want their tax dollars to go to a regime that supports these settlers. I do believe most Americans can be convinced by an honest articulation of the Palestinian grievances. Now, one of the worst outcomes to all of this is the degree to which the far right has gained a foothold in the discourse that they never should have gained in the first place. Nick Fuentes is, until I see evidence to the contrary, an anti-Semite who has problems with Jewish people as a race instead of religious Zionism or the extreme forms of Judaism that are absolutely worth criticizing. He now has an unnecessarily larger following than he did a few years ago because it looks like to the degree that he criticized Israel and religious Zionism fairly, he's been vindicated for that. And there's nothing that will shove people into the hands of far-right ideologues than censoring those far-right ideologues when they were speaking about true things. Censorship never works, and anyone who supports it should be laughed at and mocked for the fools that they are. Now, fortunately, Nick Fuentes has been allowed back on Twitter, which means he is able to be confronted by people like Destiny in a public space. I listened to the whole Twitter Spaces, X Spaces interaction, and I think it's evidence that free speech is the best tool for addressing big problems. I highly recommend people listen to the Spaces interaction from about the hour and 30-minute mark onwards when the debate gets tense. The other thing I want to say is that just like the far left, the far right are a bunch of freaks who play the same postmodern, identity politics bullshit games that the far left plays. One of their primary goals is to end the, quote, white genocide, which, to be clear, has the same merit as the so-called black genocide that the far left complains about. Are there valid concerns that the left has about policing in America? I'd say so. And is anti-white racism a real and obvious thing? Duh. But if your ideology characterizes mainstream society in 2024 as being fundamentally anti-black or fundamentally anti-white, you are blind in one or both eyes. If you have questions or think I'm wrong, please let me know. Otherwise, good luck and Godspeed.